The Cold War, a time of tension, a time of fear, a time that shaped the world as we know it. A war of ideologies, words, and threats. A standoff between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The threat of nuclear annihilation loomed large. Espionage, proxy wars, and a race for superiority. This is the story of that era. The seeds of the Cold War were sown even before World War II ended. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union masked underlying tensions. Truman and Stalin held deep suspicions of each other. The Soviet Union aimed to create a buffer zone in Eastern Europe. Stalin installed communist governments in occupied countries. The US responded with the Truman Doctrine to contain communism. This set the stage for decades of rivalry and mistrust. Post-war Europe became a tangible symbol of the Cold War divide. Winston Churchill declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent. Germany was split in two. West Germany embraced democracy and a market economy. East Germany became a communist state. Berlin was divided with the Brandenburg Gate symbolizing the separation.
In 1948, Stalin blockaded Berlin. The Berlin airlift airlifted essential supplies to the city. The blockade was lifted, symbolizing Western resolve.
Driven by fear and mistrust, both the United States and the Soviet Union embarked on a perilous arms race. The development of the hydrogen bomb, far more powerful than the atomic bomb, escalated the stakes to terrifying levels. The world watched in fear as both superpowers amassed vast arsenals of nuclear weapons, capable of destroying civilization many times over. The concept of mutually assured destruction, MAD, emerged as a chilling deterrent. The logic was grim. Any nuclear attack would inevitably lead to retaliation, resulting in the annihilation of both attacker and defender. The arms race wasn't just about nuclear weapons. Both sides invested heavily in conventional military forces, developing new technologies and engaging in a constant game of one-upmanship.
This competition extended to space as well, with the Soviet launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, in 1957, triggering the space race.
The arms race had a profound impact on global politics and the lives of ordinary people. It fueled a climate of fear and uncertainty as the threat of nuclear war became an ever-present reality. The vast sums of money and resources poured into the military-industrial complex came at the expense of social programs and economic development.
Section 5. Berlin Wall. A concrete symbol of division. In 1961, East Germany erected the Berlin Wall, a physical barrier that divided the city and became a powerful symbol of Cold War oppression. The wall, made of concrete and barbed wire, stretched for miles, cutting through neighborhoods, streets, and even families. East German authorities claimed the wall was built to prevent Western fascism from infiltrating the East, but its true purpose was to stop the mass exodus of East Germans fleeing to the West in search of freedom and opportunity.
Over the years, thousands risked their lives to escape over, under, or through the wall, while many others were captured or killed in the attempt. The Berlin Wall became an enduring image of the Cold War, a stark reminder of the human cost of ideological division and the suppression of freedom. Its fall, in 1989, which we'll explore later, would signal a turning point in history, heralding the end of the Cold War and the dawn of a new era.
Section 6, Cuban Missile Crisis, brinkmanship on a global scale. In October 1962, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union, led by Nikita Khrushchev, had secretly deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This was a direct threat to the United States, and President John F. Kennedy responded by imposing a naval blockade on Cuba. For 13 tense days, the world held its breath as the two superpowers engaged in a dangerous game of brinksmanship.
Tensions soared as Soviet ships approached the blockade line, and U.S. forces were placed on high alert. The threat of nuclear war had never felt more real. Through a combination of diplomacy, military posturing, and perhaps a bit of luck, a catastrophe was averted. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island and a secret agreement to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a sobering reminder of the fragility of peace in the nuclear age and the importance of communication and restraint.
Section 7. Vietnam War. A proxy conflict. a nation divided. The Vietnam War was another proxy conflict of the Cold War, but one that had a devastating impact on Vietnam and left deep scars on American society. The war pitted the communist North Vietnamese government, supported by the Soviet Union and China, against the US-backed South Vietnamese government. The United States, fearing the domino effect of communism spreading throughout Southeast Asia, gradually escalated its involvement in the conflict, sending hundreds of thousands of troops to fight in the jungles of Vietnam.
The war proved to be long, costly, and deeply unpopular in the United States, sparking massive protests and dividing the nation. Despite its military superiority, the United States struggled to defeat the determined North Vietnamese forces and their Viet Cong allies. The war dragged on for years, claiming the lives of millions of Vietnamese civilians and over 58,000 American soldiers. The United States eventually withdrew from Vietnam in 1973, and 2 years later, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell to the North Vietnamese. Section 8. Espionage and Subterfuge. The Shadow War. Beyond the battlefields and political standoffs, the Cold War was also fought in the shadows. Espionage and subterfuge became common tools for both sides, as they sought to gather intelligence, infiltrate each other's governments, and influence events in their favor.
Spy agencies like the CIA and the KGB played key roles in this clandestine struggle, recruiting agents, planting misinformation, and carrying out covert operations around the globe. The stakes were high, and the consequences of failure could be severe.
The Cold War produced some of the most famous espionage cases in history, from the Cambridge Five, a group of British intellectuals who spied for the Soviet Union, to Aldrich Ames, a high-ranking CIA official who sold secrets to the Soviets. These cases highlighted the constant threat of infiltration and betrayal that characterized the era. Section 9. Détente, a thaw in the Cold War. By the late 1960s, the Cold War began to thaw, ushering in a period of détente, a French word meaning relaxation of tensions.
Both the United States and the Soviet Union recognized the dangers of continued confrontation and the need to find ways to coexist peacefully. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and outer space, was an early sign of détente.
Other agreements followed, including the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT treaties, which aimed to limit the number of nuclear weapons held by each superpower. Détente led to increased cultural and scientific exchanges between the East and West, as well as a hotline between Washington and Moscow to facilitate direct communication between leaders in times of crisis.
While détente did not erase the fundamental ideological differences between the two superpowers, it did offer a glimmer of hope for a more stable and peaceful world.
Section 10. Gorbachev and Reform.
Mikhail Gorbachev, who came to power in the Soviet Union in 1985, introduced significant reforms with his policies of glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring. These reforms aimed to revitalize the Soviet economy and society by promoting transparency and encouraging limited market-like reforms.
Gorbachev's initiatives were a response to the stagnation that had plagued the Soviet Union for years. However, these changes also unleashed forces that Gorbachev could not control, leading to increased demands for political freedom and national independence within the Soviet Union and its satellite states.
The era of Gorbachev's reforms saw a significant reduction in Cold War tensions as he sought to improve relations with the West and reduce the Soviet military burden. This period marked a dramatic shift in the global balance of power and set the stage for the end of the Cold War.
Section 11. The Fall of the Wall and the End of an Era.
On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall, the most potent symbol of the Cold War, fell. This event was not just the physical collapse of a barrier, but also the collapse of decades of division between East and West Germany.
The fall of the Berlin Wall marked the beginning of the end for the Cold War. It was followed by the reunification of Germany and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, bringing an end to an era of intense geopolitical rivalry.
The end of the Cold War brought new challenges and opportunities. While the world was no longer divided along the lines of the Iron Curtain, The legacy of the Cold War continued to shape international relations and the political landscape for years to come.
The fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent end of the Cold War were monumental events that reshaped the world, offering hope for a future defined by cooperation rather than conflict.